Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my distinguished honor to host the UN side event in partnership with Human Rights Watch to call for a robust international response to the crimes against humanity targeting the Uyghurs and other target communities in Xinjiang. As a human rights lawyer of Uyghur origin, I am as proud a Uyghur as ever I can be, despite the atrocities we bear witness to today. Over half-decade into this crisis, the Uyghur community, survivors, family members of the victims, and civil society demonstrated incredible resilience, bravery, and championship, as highlighted in the UN's Uyghur report. It is their spirit that prompted journalists and world leaders to take a stance against a powerful perpetrator. The ideals of the United Nations, peace, justice, equality, and dignity are beacons lighting the way for a better world. So I hope in this peaceful union we call the United Nations, protecting liberty and the rights of Uyghurs remains the heart of these ideals. With ever-determined strength, determination, and optimism for future, I invite representatives from Canada, the United States, and Europe to deliver quick remark. Ambassador Rob Ray, a permanent representative to the UN, the Deputy to US Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield, Jeffrey Prescott, and Ms. Belen Martinez Carbonell, Managing Director for Global Agenda and Multilateral Relations, European External Action Service. Thank you so much.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much, Rehat, for not only your leadership today, but your leadership for several years on this critical question. You and I have met, had an opportunity to discuss the situation in Xinjiang, and I think it's important for everyone to know that you are personally involved in the case of your brother and your family, that you have been witness to terrible injustice in Xinjiang by the government of China. And you have our strong support and will continue to have our strong support as we work together on what is an extremely challenging but necessary task on our part to deal with the extent and the impact of human rights abuses in China. I want to start by saying that one of the ironies of my life since coming to New York has been to observe how different governments react to different events. And whenever we raise issues around human rights in China, which we have done on a number of occasions because of our perception that the Chinese government is not at all accepting of two things. One is their obligations under the Charter with respect to human rights in their own country. And the second is their tendency to always engage in the activity that we call whataboutism. So they will, when we raise a question, they will say, well, what about the indigenous people? And this is not a new experience for me, because when I visited China with Prime Minister Chrétien, and you can tell from the color of my hair that I've been around for a while. I was Premier of Ontario, went on a Team Canada mission to China. We raised the question of the rule of law in China, and we got a very vigorous response from the president at that time, who said, well, you yourself have many abuses in your own country, the treatment of indigenous people in your country, and so on. So we fully anticipate what the response of the Chinese government to this intervention by me will be. So let me anticipate it and let me respond to it. The first one is to say that this is none of your business. They've even gone further in this report and described it as illegal, which is an astonishing statement. There's nothing illegal about it. It was authorized by the Human Rights Council and was followed I must say, after some delay, the publication followed an extensive investigation by experts in the council to what's going on. And the second one is none of your business stems from the notion that these are issues for each independent country to decide on its own. And the Chinese have joined with the Russians in a small little group of friends in the UN called the Friends of the Charter. So I thought I'd bring my charter with me and read the charter to you, which Chapter 9, Article 55 says, and the title is International Economic and Social Cooperation. And this was drafted 3 or 4 years before the Universal Declaration. And it says, with a view to the creation of conditions of stability and well-being which are necessary for peaceful and friendly relations among nations based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples, the United Nations shall promote A, higher standards of living, full employment, and conditions of economic and social progress and development. B, solutions of international economic, social, health, and related problems, and international cultural and educational cooperation. And C, universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. All members, in the next article is that all members pledge themselves to take joint and separate action in cooperation with the organization, meaning the UN, for the achievement of the purposes set forth in Article 55. So this argument that our running discussion about the human rights situation in China is somehow has nothing to do with the Charter, it has nothing to do with the foundations of international law, and that these are issues that for which Canada should have no concern and express no views, is frankly simply not the case. And secondly, in response to the first point about whataboutism, is to say Canada welcomes any scrutiny, international or otherwise, of our own human rights situation. We have nothing to hide. We have much to come to terms with, as does every country with respect to the human rights situation in their own country. But we certainly don't resist any scrutiny with respect to how we conduct ourselves. We welcome the report that has come out, which includes really appalling details, and I encourage everyone to read it, and accounts of grave human rights abuses taking place in Xinjiang that, in our view, constitute international crimes, in particular, crimes against humanity. The accounts that have been described in the report and the conclusions about what these accounts show add to what is a growing body of evidence of serious systemic human rights violations that have also been raised by other independent UN experts, by civil society, such as the Human Rights Watch, and other courageous victims who've come forward. The conclusions of the report, in particular the actions with respect to what the Chinese government has done against the Uyghurs and other predominantly Muslim minorities, points to abuses and violations that we consider to be systemic and deliberate, and that international law prohibits discrimination, including that based on religious or ethnic identity, and is supposed to protect minorities in the enjoyment of their culture, professing of their religion, and the use of their language. And as I said before, we can date this not to recent days in the UN, not even to the creation of the Human Rights Council, but we can date this to the very origins of the United Nations itself. We urge the government of China to uphold its obligations and to respond directly to the concerns and recommendations that are raised in the report. We happen to think that scrutiny strengthens and helps protect multilateralism more broadly. As a country, we continue to work with our international partners on coordinated action to address the situation in Xinjiang and to ensure that the Chinese government is held to account for its actions. We want to thank the Acting High Commissioner for taking a role in this. We look forward to meeting with Mr. Volk, the new Volker Turk, the new director of the Human Rights Council, and we look forward to working with him in dealing with this matter. And we also look forward to discussions in the United Nations itself, in the General Assembly, which is coming up, and the further steps that we all have to take to deal with the extent of this oppression. 1 million people that are placed in so-called re-education camps, which could be more dutifully described as prisons or concentration camps, is not something that happens by accident. It is something that is a result of a very deliberate and extensive policy by the government of China, which China itself has described in its own words. We need to deal with this question. We need to deal with the question of what sanctions, further sanctions will be required. We need to deal with the question of what further steps can be taken to respond to the extent of this crisis. But discrimination of this kind and in such dimensions is not acceptable in today's world. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Rayhan, for bringing us all together, and it's nice to see so many good friends here. This conversation is incredibly important, and I'm heartened to see all those here in this room who are passionate about finding ways to bring international attention, further international attention, and shine a spotlight on what's happening in Xinjiang. President Biden has made clear that addressing the atrocities in Xinjiang is a priority for him personally, and so he's made it a priority for this administration. For us, this first means establishing the facts. It's why Secretary of State Blinken reaffirmed the Department of State's determination that what is occurring in Xinjiang amounts to genocide and crimes against humanity. It's why here in New York, Ambassador Thomas Greenfield has argued forcefully for greater UN attention to the crisis in Xinjiang, and why she, along with others, pushed for the release of the High Commissioner's report, which we are grateful to see, and I echo the encouragement for all of you to read it from cover to cover. Here in New York, we've also consistently focused on this issue as well. Last summer, Ambassador Thomas Greenfield co-hosted an ARIA meeting of the Security Council with Security Council members focused on the human rights situation in Xinjiang. She's also met personally, as I have and other members of the State Department, with survivors to better understand their experiences and those of their family members, something we're committed to doing and will keep doing, both to understand what's happening, but also to bring attention to what's happening as well. The release of the High Commissioner's report reaffirms what we've all known to be true and what's happening in Xinjiang. Appalling crimes are being committed against Uyghurs and Turkic people in a brutal and systematic way, full stop. The report calls on China to account for their egregious practices and release all individuals arbitrarily detained, and I think Ambassador Ray was quite eloquent in describing how we should look at what's happening in Xinjiang, and for the international community to explore additional avenues to pursue further documentation and ultimately accountability. And by the way, the fact is, China does not limit its repression to its own territory. The Biden administration is committed to protecting Uyghur human rights activists as they conduct their important work and research and advocacy, including here in the United States. It's imperative that we end China's use of transnational repression and harassment to ensure more generally that authoritarian governments and their proxies have no reach within the borders of the United States. Calling out these atrocities is important, but it's certainly not enough. President Biden, for his part, has taken action. We worked diligently with Congress to pass the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, and on other steps, we're now focused on implementation of that law. We've also called on other governments to follow suit. Indeed, just last week, we saw the European Union announce a proposed regulation to ban all imports globally of goods made with forced labor at any stage of production. I think that's a step forward and a reminder that we're strongest in these efforts when we are working together. While I'm pleased that the United States has led on this issue, we importantly have not done so alone. To amplify our collective impact, we've been strategic in coordinating sanctions actions that we've taken with our partners, including the United Kingdom, Canada, and the EU, against individuals for their role and their connection to human rights abuses in Xinjiang. We will continue to do so. And we've also applied export controls and investment restrictions on China's companies who are complicit in the surveillance and biometric registration of Uyghurs and others. All of this is important, but let me close this brief intervention to step back just for one moment. How these atrocities are addressed goes ultimately to the credibility of the UN system, to the credibility of our international system itself. The fact is that all member states have committed to honor the principles enshrined in the UN Charter, as Ambassador Ray just pointed out, and to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's deeply disheartening to see a country that has been so central to the creation of the modern UN system and enjoys the status of a permanent member on the Security Council so profoundly violating its commitments. 2 weeks ago in San Francisco, Ambassador Thomas Greenfield laid out a set of principles for responsible Security Council membership in a speech that I commend to you when you have an opportunity. One of those principles is for the Security Council to work to ensure that universal human rights have meaning everywhere. We believe that all Security Council members and member states have a responsibility to uphold these rights, both at home and abroad. And the United States will continue its practice of calling out members of the Council for such violations, whether permanent members or not. How we collectively address this crisis, these challenges, is of critical importance. We want to do so with urgency, intentionality, and inclusivity. We want to work with our partners and allies, but frankly also work with all of you. We welcome the support, the energy, the creative thinking of civil society, of activists, of researchers, and journalists, like many of those who are here in this packed room. We will need all of your energy and support, and that's why today's meeting is so important. So once again, thank you, Rehan. Thanks to the Atlantic Council. Thanks for Human Rights Watch for sponsoring this, and for the many others here involved in this, for your tireless passion and advocacy, for everything that you're doing every day, for organizing this event and many others like it. My team and I are very much looking forward to the discussion to come, to listening and to learning from all of you. Thank you very much.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Your Excellencies, fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen, it's for me to be an honor to be here today representing the European Union, in particular the External Action Service, on this very important topic. Over the past years, the European Union and its member states have been among the most vocal partners in denouncing serious and systematic human rights violations across China, including the large-scale repression of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And we're determined to continue seizing any opportunity to voice our grave concerns. So thanks a lot for providing us this opportunity this afternoon. The European Union has been raising for years its concerns over the human rights situation across the country, with the Chinese authorities at all levels, from the highest official and political levels downwards, including at the EU-China summit earlier this year. The European Union has also been systematically raising its concerns in all relevant international fora, and in particular, as you all know, in the human rights bodies meetings, including the Human Rights Council and the United Nations General Assembly's Third Committee. In addition to expressing the gravity of our concerns, the European Union has already shown its willingness to act, showing that impunity for human rights violation is not an option. This is why last year, on the 22nd of March of 2021, the European Union imposed sanctions on one entity and 4 individuals who are responsible for, involved in, or associated with, among others, the systematic use of forced labor, arbitrary detentions, systematic violations of freedom of religion or belief against Uyghurs in Xinjiang. The release of the assessment report of the human rights concerns in Xinjiang, autonomous region of Uyghur, by the Office of the High Commission of Human Rights on 31st of August is a crucial turning point. This adds to the existing body of evidence, including the so-called Xinjiang police files disclosed last June, which brought new light to the grave and systematic human rights violation occurring in the region. Through his statement on 1st of September, shortly after the publishing of the report, the High Representative for Foreign Affairs, Josep Borrell Fontelles, welcomed the indeed long-awaited release of the report. As the High Representative stated on that occasion, the assessment report underscored the serious human rights violations that are occurring. These violations may, other panelists have said already, according to the report, constitute international crimes, in particular crimes against humanity. The report makes reference to the existing of a large network of political re-education camps, mass arbitrary detentions, widespread surveillance, trafficking and control measures, systematic and severe restrictions on the exercise of fundamental freedoms, including freedom of religion or belief, as well as the use of forced labor, torture, forced abortion and sterilization, birth control and family separation policies, and sexual and gender-based violence. The gravity of these violations calls for the international community to act. As the report states, the human rights situation in Xinjiang requires urgent attention by the Chinese government, the United Nations, and in particular its human rights bodies, as well as the international community more broadly. The European Union fully supports the Office recommendations. We believe that a proper follow-up discussion to the report is opportune, be it in Beijing, in New York, or in Geneva. And the High Representative conveyed this message to Mr. Volker Turk yesterday. Let me add that at the 23rd EU-China Summit that was held on 1st of April 2022, the EU leaders, the European Union leaders, recall our grave concerns about China's treatment of minorities in Xinjiang. Those same leaders also mentioned individual human rights cases of concern at the discussions in the summit. The European leaders in particular stressed the need to relaunch the EU-China human rights dialogue, and on this the Chinese Prime Minister Li Keqiang agreed. On this basis, we will keep pushing for the dialogue to be organized as soon as possible, even if China seems very reluctant in reality. If and when the dialogue will take place, the EU's concern in relation to the human rights situation in Xinjiang will be certainly raised. I would like to conclude by stressing that the human rights situation in China, and especially in Xinjiang, requires increased scrutiny and continuous monitoring by human rights mechanisms of the UN, be it again Geneva or New York. In particular, we hope that the Human Rights Council will have the opportunity to have a substantive discussion of the report. Together with its like-minded, as has been mentioned already, the EU will firmly stand for the independence and impartiality of the Office of the Human Rights Commission, of the Office of the OHCHR mandate, and we will make sure that the narrative China is employing now to undermine the findings of the report and of the office itself will be constantly fact-checked and scrutinized for accuracy. Thanks a lot to the organizers and to all the other panelists. Thank you.
Before turning to the second session, I would like to extend my gratitude to Jacob Blaston Institute for their generosity to make this event happen. And second, I would like to thank my dear colleague and friend, Ksenia, for her leadership and remarkable support for my work at the Atlantic Council, and our entire Middle Eastern team. Without them, this event wouldn't be possible. So the second panel will be moderated by senior editor at The Economist, Gadi Epstein, who is one of the fine journalists whose work really illuminated the truths happening on the ground. Thank you.
I think the panelists could just come up. Hi, thank you so much for coming. This is an important event and an important time. And we also have quite a few important topics to discuss, and so I'll try and get quickly through the introductions. We're very honored here to have Zaid Raad Al-Hussein, professor of the practice of law and human rights at the University of Pennsylvania and a former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Dr. Fernand de Varenne, UN Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues, and a former guest professor at Peking University and the University of Hong Kong. Sophie Richardson, hello, China Director for Human Rights Watch. And you've met Rehan Assad, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, human rights lawyer, advocate, and someone who's advocated very passionately on this issue, this cause, which has affected her and her family in a very personal way that continues to this day. And Rehan, I think that's a good place to start, with an update on the current situation in Xinjiang, because I think there's a misconception out there that the worst is all in the past. This view is encouraged as well by Chinese state propaganda and official statements in a kind of Orwellian two-step, which is to say they weren't camps, but anyway, they're closed now. And so I want you to, if you could, tell us kind of what's going on now and recently in Xinjiang.
Yeah, thank you so much. The Chinese government is obviously an autocrat, but also a big bureaucracy. That's why it was able to document its own atrocity crime, which the UN has used so effectively to expose through the Chinese government's own statements against the practice and what's happening. Seeing that potential UN visit and as well as the international scrutiny, the Chinese government, in prep for that, started to remove some of the visible signs of repression and create the seduction that Uyghurs are living happily and their lives actually return to some sort of normalcy, which is nothing far from the truth. In fact, if anything, that raises even greater alarm as to what's happening behind the walls and the internment camps. In order to provide this veneer of legitimacy to its extrajudicial centers and so-called re-education camps, now the Chinese government has sentenced the vast majority of these detainees without due process or trial to prisons, and they start to call them prisons, but actually it's none of that diminish the concentrated nature and collective punishment of the detainees. So it's still a prison camps, and we should not let the Chinese government off the hook and by calling it and normalizing what the state doing, because at the end of the day, this is a state violence and it is terrorizing the entire Uyghur population. And then the COVID hit the past month. I think that's something that we really need to be warned, because while the Shanghai as the financial hub, the Uyghur region is the epicenter of repression. Shanghai citizens can actually protest against the government or post videos, but when the Uyghurs did, the state media released a statement saying that they would be facing separatism charges if they dared to even question and say, or even seek grievances. I mean, separatism looming over everybody's head, and coupled with years of repression, Uyghurs would be too terrified to even tell the truth, and starvation is becoming the norm in cities like Gulja, which is one of the greatest cities that I love the most, and that's what's happening. So I hope that the international community remain vigilant, and it's time for us to take the recommendations of the UN to actions.
And Sophie, do you want to add a little bit about the current events? And you referenced Rehan referenced the recent lockdowns as well. I don't know if you want to add some color on that.
Sure, I'll just add 2 quick points. First, thanks, it's great to be here. Thank you for all you have done. You are extraordinary. We published about 10 days ago a new piece of research looking at the rates of formal imprisonment in the region over the last couple of years. So this is as distinct from people being held in forms of arbitrary detention, essentially to substantiate the point that you were just making, that what we think we're seeing now is an increase in the formal prosecutions. Let's not for a moment delude ourselves into thinking that this has anything to do with the rule of law. That the idea is to launder these prosecutions through the formal judicial system to create a veneer of legitimacy, which is of great concern. But 2 other quick points I want to flag at the outset of the discussion. One is that I think we all need to keep our ears very much to the ground in the immediate aftermath of the UN report release for reprisals against people in the community, both inside the country, but also against people in diaspora communities. And then for those of us who are also part of this conversation because we're concerned about the integrity of the UN system, I think we also have to be concerned about these very vitriolic attacks by Chinese diplomats on the High Commissioner, on the special procedures, against people who are making interventions at the Human Rights Council that really do fundamentally attack the integrity of that system. So I'll just throw those points out.
Well, Zay, let's get to that report. At long last, after what seemed like a very long delay, in the final hours of your successor's term as High Commissioner for Human Rights, we finally got this report. We've heard it described in some detail here in the remarks before the panel. Can you give us what your impressions were, what you felt was important from the report, what was satisfying or good to see in it, and what was disappointing, if anything, about it?
Well, I'm delighted to be here with everyone, and thank you, Rehat, for organizing it. So I read the report very carefully, line by line. It is an excellent report, meticulously put together. And the office has to be given credit because it wasn't mandated by the Human Rights Council. It was done at the discretion of the outgoing High Commissioner for Human Rights, my successor, and with the knowledge that there was going to be a very powerful reaction. So it needs to be given credit for that. However, there are two shortcomings in the way that I read this report. One is, given the facts alleged, particularly the wide berth given to arbitrariness in so much of the way in which this hard strike policy has been applied, it's everything from principles to law to process or lack of due process. I would have applied the genocide lens to it using the lower threshold, where I would have said it could not exclude acts of genocide, particularly Article 2B of the Genocide Convention, from having been perpetrated. As all of you know, and that's the act of causing serious bodily harm with an intent to destroy in part or in whole a group. And the group is identifiable. The actus reus, the conduct, it's manifest. Even when there's no access, it's manifest that there is something, as Sophie just said, that is of design here. Now, the difficult thing, as all of you know, is, of course, how to establish intent that could be proven in a court of law. And here it's more difficult to make that assessment. Much of what we can see and glean brings us to that conclusion, but is it good enough to meet a certain threshold in a court of law? And that is why I would use the lower threshold. The second shortcoming is that when my former office, or when I was in my office as a former High Commissioner, I'm getting my titles all mixed up. So the High Commissioner has great discretion in what they decide to put into the recommendations. Normally speaking, the High Commissioner has very little leeway to do anything to the research conducted by the team. And OHCHR has a fabulous team working on China. What was disappointing to me is that the natural conclusion or the natural recommendation that would follow a conclusion that that crimes against humanity may have been committed would be then for the High Commissioner to make a recommendation to the Human Rights Council that a commission of inquiry be established. And until such a point, the assessment report, there will be a follow-up assessment report, and the monitoring and reporting will continue as normal. In other words, this is not a report that's deposited and that's the end of the story. The monitoring and reporting continues. There'll be another one. But what ought to happen is the Human Rights Council should be establishing a commission of inquiry. And when that happens, then there's no need for OHCHR to issue its report.
I don't know if anyone wants to, I have a question for Fernand next, but if anyone wants to chime in specifically about the report first, okay, we'll move on. And we'll come back to the report. Fernand, you are well ensconced in this human rights system, the UN human rights system. how should that system respond? What are some of the possible responses that you think would be appropriate at this point?
Well, I think, for example, either through a resolution of the Human Rights Council or of the General Assembly, we should have a situation where the very serious allegations that were raised in reports, and detailed, very well detailed as a matter of fact, has been mentioned, there should be an investigative team set up, as has been done in the case, I think, of Syria, Sri Lanka, Ukraine, Myanmar recently, Ethiopia also, as a matter of fact, because there are many allegations that were made, extremely serious and well detailed, but there is a lot that have not been covered, in my opinion. There is the issue that it is mentioned in the report, for example, that there are shrines and sites of historical, cultural significance that have been destroyed. There's even more than that. The language of the Uyghurs has been almost eliminated as medium of instruction at most levels of education. So when you look at the situation that is actually detailed, we could talk about the incarceration rates, which seems to have gone up, the decreased fertility of Uyghur and other Muslim women that has gone down dramatically appears. All of this is more indirect evidence. We need more data to detail, to record these extremely serious crimes against humanity and other type of offenses. But there's one element which I think, in relation to the report, which is missing, that I'd like to mention. This is not only about a massive scale and gravity of offenses. This is collective punishment. It's the people actually who are targeted. Yeah. And we could say that there is an attempt to suppress, maybe perhaps eradicate the history, the culture, the language of the Uyghurs specifically. And I think there's this collective element, whether you call it crimes against humanity or genocide, that needs to be looked at much more deeply. This report is an important first step. A lot of the data, or some of the data, is indirect. We have to extrapolate from things. But this is so serious. We are talking about hundreds of thousands, millions of people that are affected, families that are being separated, and other types of, call them atrocities or human rights violations. If we truly believe in peace, justice, and equality, I think the UN as an institution, either through a resolution of the member states at the General Assembly or the Human Rights Council, and a coalition of the Friends of Human Rights, Canada, United States and other countries, Japan, Brazil, maybe this is the direction that ought to be looked at, as we've done for Sri Lanka, as I said, Syria, Ethiopia, Myanmar, and Ukraine most recently. And one last comment. I think it was Martin Luther King who said, to be silent is to be an accomplice. Honestly, I think the United Nations has been silent too long.
Well, let's talk about that. I mean, the Human Rights Council has not even considered a resolution against commenting on on the many human rights allegations made against China over the years, has never once, since it was formed in 2006, even taken up a resolution about any of those allegations, whether it was Hong Kong, Tibet, or now Xinjiang. This obviously speaks to, there's some, as Sophie mentioned, pressure and intimidation that Chinese officials and others exert on people within the system. There's other points of leverage that China's obviously willing to use. They have a lot of influence in the United Nations. I was wondering what you think can happen now with the Human Rights Council. We've just had some strong statements by people who represent a few seats on the Human Rights Council. What needs to happen now? Who needs to lead at the Human Rights Council? Who needs to take action? Is it realistic that something will happen now that this report has come out? And I'll put that to anybody. We can start with Sophie and then work around.
Oh, Gotti, it's time to make history. It is time to make history. Get out there, run a resolution that puts this report on the Council's agenda with a view towards establishing exactly the kind of investigative mechanism. Uyghurs do not deserve any less. And I say this at a time when, for 2 or 3 decades, we have watched governments try hard. I give you credit for that. Here I am giving you credit. It happens. for all kinds of different interactions, for raising individual cases, for trying to make progress through bilateral human rights dialogues, through running exchange programs. And Beijing's response to that is to commit crimes against humanity. It hasn't worked. Those other strategies haven't worked. And I think we are at a point in time where not only does this community deserve this kind of response, which is what the 70 years of an international human rights architecture is designed to do, it's also about protecting that architecture, right? And showing that no state is above the law, that no matter how powerful the Chinese government thinks it is, its impunity has to come to an end. It's not clear what else anybody should wait for. And I think this is really a moment for all of the governments that have been concerned about this issue, about other Chinese government human rights violations, including ones now taking place in their own countries, and say, enough, enough. We have to play by these rules, you do too.
Rehan?
So, in the spirit of we must give credit when it's due, I think one of the key components of the report that I particularly appreciated was the survivors' accounts were highlighted in a sense line by line. When you read the horrors that these brave survivors experience in these camps, like you get a sense of the injustice. Like you for even a second, you may even live with them, and it's truly remarkable. And I really appreciate that when at time the Chinese government has relentlessly attacked the integrity of the survivors, we now finally got the UN stamp that this is actually as real as it can get. Despite the Chinese government's, whether it's a political coercion or diplomacy at the UN, member states must table a resolution at this point, a full commission of inquiry. One of the first recommendations of the UN is we must make sure the victims, the people who disappeared. Enforced disappearance is a language may feel like a subjective term, but I feel it so personally. People, my loved ones and extended family members or neighbors did disappear. And we need to make sure that each individual is accounted for. Well, what I would like to see is a missing person mechanism under the full commission of inquiry that we established or sought to establish for other atrocity crimes, and make sure that the UN has unfettered access. This atrocity is unique in a sense that the state, the Chinese government itself, is the ultimate perpetrator. So we need to keep in mind those cultural components of what's happening, who is the perpetrator. There's no way that we can actually ask the victims or Uyghurs what's happening when the state actually going to charge you with separatism and terrorism. You can't even tell the truth. So be mindful of this, and I really would love to see a full commission of inquiry.
Well, I'd like to put this same question to you. My experience reporting on the Human Rights Council in my previous role covering China's kind of relationship with the world was that resolutions weren't being put forward mainly because they weren't sure of whether one would pass. I'm not sure what position we think, what kind of vote counters you guys are, and whether that dynamic has maybe changed a little bit since the report came out. But can you tell us maybe from your either past experience with when China-related issues come up, or what you're seeing now, what you think is the dynamic there about whether something can be pushed forward, even if maybe we don't have certainty about what would be the result of a resolution? Is it important just to put it forward, even if China were to win a vote?
If I may,
yeah.
my own view is that to not do anything would be to allow a situation which is where you have crimes against humanity committed, perhaps even genocide. So I think we have reached a scale and a level of gravity that inaction is no longer possible. And it would seem to me that there are enough member states of the United Nations, particularly in the General Assembly, who are committed to human rights, that are truly friends and believe in justice and equality. And you have a number of Muslim majority states, which it seems to me might be able to move on this to some extent. To not do anything would mean to actually simply let the situation of atrocities being continued or alleged atrocities. And therefore, whatever the count is, I think there has to be a movement of a number of states who already have raised their voices. And I think that has to build into momentum. I hate to say the coalition of the willing, I will say a community of the good, or friends of human rights. But there are a number of countries, North and South. You need a coalition of the North and South, who actually can be, I think, mobilized in this area. Because if we allow this to go unpunished, what kind of message is that also being propagated in other countries of the world where you have other minorities, and there's a number of situations developing right now, where you have a growing scapegoating of minorities, I'm not going to name any specific here, and that if you allow any one country to go unpunished in relation to crimes against humanity in relation to minorities, that opens the door to a potential genocides. And we have to remember the United Nations has not always been very good in preventing genocide in the past. Here, where perhaps we have an opportunity to do something much more proactive. Otherwise, we are going to actually prepare the ground, I think, for very, very unfortunate developments. But once again, there are enough countries, I think, today to move ahead.
Jane, what do you think?
Okay, so it's difficult in these circumstances to always move from a particular action undertaken by the Secretariat, in this case, the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, to then generate the sort of reactions that you'd want to see in the Human Rights Council or indeed in the General Assembly. So certain things really need to happen beforehand. And here one always has to discriminate between UNM, as in UN member states, and UNS, as in UN Secretariat. And both have to play together. The Human Rights Council is an intergovernmental body. It will never discharge its responsibilities with moral consistency. It will not do it. There's too much hypocrisy, too many interests. You can never achieve that. What you can achieve with the independent mechanisms, special rapporteurs, what we call special procedures, or the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, is you can achieve a modicum of let's say more than a modicum of moral consistency, which makes it difficult then to go into the arguments that Bob Ray mentioned about whataboutism, because the office discharges its responsibilities vis-a-vis all states. So there is no selectivity as such, all states. What I would hope for is that the new High Commissioner would tackle this on right from the start. First statement is acknowledge the report, explain that this assessment process is going to continue, that there would be a follow-up, and back the setting up of COI. I would like to hear it from the Secretary General. If I'd like to hear it from him as well. And if the leadership from the Secretariat side is saying it, this then greatly enhances the possibility that those countries present here, when they start to canvass for votes, will have more success at doing so. It's of course not easy, but how many times was I told that every time I proposed the COI it would never happen, and then it does happen in the end. But you have to go through the sequence of back and forth. So really what I'd like to see now is the new High Commissioner speak to it, backed by the Secretary General, and that then will start a process in the Human Rights Council or the General Assembly. And of course with the support of the special procedures and special rapporteurs.
It's important to point out the role of the special procedures and special rapporteurs. During this time of what was silence for several years from the High Commissioner's office, we had important statements from the special rapporteurs about China that were, I think, unprecedented. They were very strongly worded statements. I mean, unprecedented in the sense that they were going beyond what the system was prepared to say in a kind of unanimous voice, amongst the special rapporteurs. Maybe not totally unprecedented on some other issue, but for China, it was a pretty remarkable step. Did you were participating in one of those statements, or?
Yes, indeed, Gadi.
And can you tell me a little bit about? Did you face pressure related to that? Or repercussions, or threats?
Well, repercussions, I'm not really entitled to go too much into detail, but there's always some kind of pressure. But as
Yeah, but if you could also go into just the thinking process of doing those statements, yeah.
no, all of us are aware in our work as event experts that there can be reactions, there can be consequences, in fact. And there have been situations in the past where special rapporteurs have faced repercussions, quite serious, in fact, and threats. But that's the nature of our task, our mandate, and we are fully aware that there could be that. But because of the independent nature of our positions, we can take vocal approaches, raise issues which it would be difficult diplomatically or politically for the Human Rights Council and other parts of the UN institution to deal with. And there are quite a few, it's not only China, there have been other countries where other issues have been raised and there have been certain repercussions. But we do play an extremely important role because of the independent nature of our positions, that we can raise sometimes difficult issues with a degree of freedom and flexibility that is quite difficult with other institutions of the UN, obviously.
After this next question, unless we might end up filibustering more on this panel like diplomats do, but I will try and see if there are any questions from the audience. So if you have one in mind, be ready. So what other actors in the human rights system, human rights groups, member states outside of the UN, what kind of action are you looking for from them to keep this issue going, to make sure that the interest doesn't die down? And we heard a little bit, I think, about one possible avenue of action that's actually, I think, been very effective, which is the Forced Labor Prevention Act here in the US, and some parallel actions either under consideration or going on in other countries. Where would you focus your attention, for where you think action needs to come from?
I think corporate accountability is an incredibly important part of this because, our supply chain is tainted with Uyghurs slave labor, and we cannot tolerate that.
I don't think the mic picked up the beginning of what you just said, which was corporate accountability, right? That's a pretty important
very important, point. And business, obviously, they prioritize their full profit interests, but at the same time, we cannot achieve interests on the backs of slaves. That's just intolerable. And modern slavery is as abhorrent as the past slavery. That's something that we must reject. But also, in other atrocities, we have seen countries have used or allowed taking upon cases under the theory of universal jurisdiction. Two Uyghur groups actually filed a case in Argentina under the same legal theory that the groups on behalf of Myanmar filed. There's a pending ICC case in the International Criminal Court, for example. If there is an open investigation, it allows each one of us, and also like family members or observant citizens, to tip the prosecutor to make sure that perpetrators can be held to account. A state cannot just commit atrocity with impunity. Accountability is each member of the Uyghur community is seeking, because that would have the ultimate deterrence effect. So I hope countries around the world, as principally as they did for other atrocity crime, would make sure that there would be, if cases are filed, there would be no political interference, and they respect judicial independence to make sure that victims have the opportunity to be heard. I think even the opportunity to be heard would give some measure of hope and justice to the Uyghur community.
Sophie, we've known each other, I think, for almost 20 years, during which time you've seen many different efforts and mechanisms and strategies for trying to get China to come to the table to talk about human rights, or to, different ways of trying to approach China about human rights. What are you hoping for now, and what do you think, are there things you would recommend against that people are talking about? I mean, you can go either way with this.
I think we have to try what we haven't tried before. And I think that's why what the Council chooses to do and what member states do, and whether we can actually pursue different forms of avenues to legal accountability, or, for example, initiatives to try to find missing family members. I think that's an important project for governments that have diaspora communities to try to push ahead with. But Gadi, I just wanted to add 2 quick points, what you were saying earlier about the Council. I think one other piece of the UN human rights ecosystem that has really done its fair share of the heavy lifting are a number of the treaty body reviews. Let's think back to August of 2018 and the Committee to Eliminate Racial Discrimination review, at which really this issue moved very much onto the front pages of newspapers worldwide. We've just seen the the Committee on Human Rights review Hong Kong, which was an exercise that actually involved committee members expressing concerns about the Hong Kong delegation's safety and whether their participation would constitute a violation of the national security law, which was not sort of the norm for these kinds of exercises. But just a brief word on some of the diplomatic math of a possible resolution in the vote. What I would love for people to recall is that in the last Human Rights Council elections, not only did China get a considerably smaller number of votes, a significantly smaller number of votes than it ever had before, it got the lowest number of votes of any of the 15 governments that got elected. And it was so low that it actually raised the possibility that had one other government from Asia run, China might have lost. Now, if you'd asked us, I think any of us, if we had entertained that possibility ahead of those elections, that that's what those results would be, I think we probably would have been a bit skeptical. But I bring that up simply to say, let's try what hasn't been tried before. Let's imagine there could be a different outcome. And let's do this, let us proceed as this system is designed to exist, to protect people and to hold the perpetrators of atrocity crimes accountable. That has to be possible in order for this system to still have integrity.
I think it's a very good point to throw it to the audience for questions, if there are any. I don't know if I see anyone. Oh, right over here.
Thank you. My name is Josh Rosenzweig. I want to commend all of you for being as positive and optimistic as you can be about the ability to take this forward and to, as Sophie said, make history, to try things that perhaps haven't been done before. But I was struck by a comment that Jeff Prescott made in his remarks earlier, that this is a real test of the credibility of the UN and the international system. And I wonder if some of you could perhaps speak to how critical the damage might be to the international system if this action is not taken forward, if it fails to mobilize. Because I think not only is it important to think optimistically about what is possible, but also the consequences of what might happen if action is not taken. Thanks.
Thank you, Josh. Who wants to take that one? Zaid?
Well, I mean, we continue to become unstuck, essentially. The world is degrading, and the institutions that reflect the state of the world will degrade with it. It's not easy to confront. The human rights community knows that it's not easy to confront. The humanitarians will look after those who've been most affected and suffer directly. The human rights are the ones who confront, and you pay a price for it. And that's why the frontline human rights defenders are always the heroes of the story. The sacrifices that they make are phenomenal. I mean, the first instinct of us as human beings is self-preservation, and they overcome it. I mean, Rayhat and your family, to achieve a better world. So you hope within governments that there are sufficient numbers of people who are sort of won over and inspired by this sort of example. I mean, all the great personalities in history are those sorts of people, right? Are people who do something that none of us normally would be able to do. And if we can just find a core within the international community to stand up for them, this would be enough. And I think the point you're raising, Josh, is an important one, because the next commission of inquiry that comes along, or at least if the Human Rights Council wants to impose one on a small country, then you can imagine the reaction. They'll say, well, it's all fine and well, you're imposing it on us. Why don't you try and do it on China? Right? So the moral consistency, no double standards, no playing around, no fast and loose. Do your job and stick to the law as best you know it. And I think if we can inspire a chain of reaction that one gives sort of courage to the next one, and you have this interplay between states and the independent mandate holders, the special rapporteurs, the new High Commissioner, and then the big human rights organizations, you know, we can get an outcome. One should never believe that these sorts of things are impossible.
Fernand,
I agree completely. I'm not sure I could add much more to that. But at the end of the day, the human rights architecture is there to protect those who cannot protect themselves. And I don't think inaction is an option, particularly when we come to the work of the human rights defenders, civil society, members of the Uyghur community who are risking their lives, who are risking their families. We owe it, those of us who work in the area of human rights, owe it to actually raise the visibility, try to increase pressure as much as possible, because unless you have more visibility, more pressure, the situation will not improve. And we are leaving people who are extremely vulnerable to suffer and have atrocities and other harm arrive to them. If there's one thing, and I think it's important that member states, there is a core of member states of the United Nations that certainly can work within the system. As we've heard earlier, the new Human Rights Commissioner should take a strong position. Secretary General should take position. There is a need for an investigative commission of some sort, but also use us special procedures, because we can raise visibility and increase pressure because of our independence in ways which are also quite difficult. And I like to use that expression, please use us. That is an open invitation. And in fact, you will be hearing more about a number of issues in the near future. But we have to work together on this. Otherwise, we allow situations of grave injustice to continue.
This morning we hosted an event about victims' intimidation. And the same principle goes to witness intimidation, and the same principle goes to victims' intimidation too. A lot of survivors of the Uyghur origin did come forward, as Fernand mentioned. But if the international community refused to take a stand, it would send a chilling message of survivors of other atrocities. Because no matter how brave they can be, the international community refused to stand with them. So when we look at the Uyghur issue, it's not just about the Uyghurs themselves. It sends this message that, you know, as long as the state is powerful enough, it can rally the other member states and can get away with impunity. So it is a true test for the UN and as well as many multilateral institutions, because in other atrocities, there are regional bodies you can also seek justice. But in the Uyghur issues, the path to justice has been long and torturous.
Can I add a point to this? So a few years ago, I was at a dinner where Vladimir Kara-Murza was being honored. He's now imprisoned in the Russian Federation. A hugely brave, amazing character. And in the audience, someone said to him, Vladimir, why should we care what happens in Russia? I mean, we are living here in New York. Russia is far away. Why should it matter to us? And his response was devastating. He said, if Putin can do this to his own people, just imagine what he can do to you. That is the lesson of why it is we care about human rights and human rights defenders around the world. It may sound self-serving, but the point is that history is replete with that experience. That we say this is a local thing, local phenomenon, none of our business, so forth. And before you know it, it is our business, every one of us. And so there's a very immediate sense that should occupy many countries around the world. And if you don't take a stand now on so many of these issues, as we've seen in other contexts, it's often too late for you to take it at a later stage.
Are there any more questions from the audience? over here.
Hi, Kristen Broker with the Jacob Lassley Institute. Without inviting too much repetition, I wanted to ask the panelists to maybe share a few more thoughts about the process of interacting with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in the production of this report, and how we can maintain that capacity of the UN going forward. I mean, I know Rayhan, perhaps Sophie, you've had a lot of interaction with OHCHR over the last couple of years, and to former High Commissioner Zaid, you initiated several of these autonomous investigations into human rights crises over the course of your time in the office. It's a capacity that I think is really extraordinary in the UN system, and one that'll be under threat now more than ever before. What's the most effective way to go about preserving that capacity? I mean, you've said you'd like the new High Commissioner to come in right out of the gate, committing to continue that investigation. What can those of us and other governments do to help ensure that that happens? Thanks.
Good question.
Do you want to start?
Well, I'm delighted to see you, and I just noticed that Felice is sitting next to you. So, well, look, I think it takes time for any new High Commissioner to understand fully how to manage the office, because there's so many different functions, and you've got to try and get it right. And Felice has written an excellent book about how difficult it is for any High Commissioner to do it. I think the point that has to always be made to an incoming High Commissioner is that the pressure you're going to face, whatever the member states say about you, whatever abuse they throw at you, whatever the death threats, whatever, it doesn't even come close to the pressure you're going to feel from the victims or the survivors of the most appalling gross human rights violations. Because that pressure is deeper, and it really can reduce you to a wreck. The pressure from member states is manageable. The pressure from feeling a certain inadequacy, that you're not doing enough, and sometimes you feel that whatever you do, issue reports, do press conferences, whatever you do, it's not even close to being enough or adequate to the task. And that feeling of inadequacy, the best way to handle it is actually to come out strong and not find yourself caught somehow, trapped in the middle. The report of the outgoing High Commissioner was issued. There was no press conference that accompanied it. There was no presentation of it. I would be delighted if the new High Commissioner, first act, were to do a press conference and a proper rollout of the report, and then invite maybe some of those who drafted it. We didn't always used to do it to protect the identity of those who are drafting. I remember, I think on the Kashmir report, we didn't do that. But on some of them we did, and but that would be a good way to start.
Does anyone else want to chime in on that?
Briefly, Kristen, we're old friends, so maybe you'll let me alter the question a tiny little bit. I mean, we've always had a very healthy relationship with the office, but we felt compelled about 5 years ago to do an entire report looking specifically at Chinese government threats to the UN human rights system, which looked all the way from the ECOSOC accreditation process all the way through to the kinds of threats that are being described here. I mean, well beyond just the expected dishonest submissions put forward to the UPR process, for example, from the Chinese government, active efforts to undermine the human rights system. I think at this point in time, 5 years later, we can say that we're as concerned as we were about that 5 years ago, but now more broadly across the UN system. I mean, for example, when you look at the marrying up of things like developmental goals and the Belt and Road Initiative, in ways that has very little scrutiny, or the engagement of some big Chinese firms in UN projects. I think it invites a lot of questions about the system as a whole's ability to resist pressure inducements, offers of resources from Chinese state actors, and I think that's a big concern going forward.
If I could add one more point, the outgoing commissioner emphasized the importance of engagement. She said, I had to engage with the Chinese government. I had to make that personal trip to be able to finally produce this report. There was one line in the report that actually I saw the value of her argument in which she said the Chinese government has promised that it dismantled all the so-called vocational training schools. But when we ask how many members of the Uyghur community have graduated from these schools, they said it's a dynamic. People are coming and they're leaving, so we cannot provide the estimated number. So they were able to expose the inconsistency. But that doesn't mean that you have to wait the report and not release it and just hoping that one day there would be engagement, because the victims and their suffering cannot wait. And when you know that for sure, the state is not cooperating. There are many members like me, Uyghur communities that are survivors, so you can use alternative means to still produce a report.
And very, very quickly, I think without sounding mercenary, I hope we realize that we need to protect the global human rights architecture, because it's very easy to underfund, undermine this. And states have to live up to ensure that the human rights mechanisms are resourced sufficiently. Because in my opinion, even this report, which is very good, it's amazing what they did in relation to the resources they actually had, quite frankly. Thank you.
Yeah, and I just want to close by reiterating Zaid's remarks, which I think are an amazing way to frame it for the next High Commissioner. The pressure from China may be tremendous. It will be tremendous, but the pressure from survivors will obviously weigh even more, I would think, on him and on all the other actors in the UN human rights system. And I hope they take that to heart. I think it's a good way to think about it going into the next term. And I wanted to thank you with that for your time with us today. I think I learned a lot. It was an honor to speak with all of you. Thanks. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you.